Bon dia, welcome to Exploring Timor-Leste, the podcast that talks about Southeast Asia's best kept travel secret. I'm your host Jonty, and I'll share first-hand insights, expert interviews and practical travel tips. Whether you're a traveller, a culture lover or just curious about places rarely covered in the mainstream, you're in the right place. Let's explore Timor-Leste. Today's episode is about hiking on Atauro Island. This is the area of Timor-Leste which I did the most hiking of other than around Dili. That's because it's relatively easy to get to from Dili, so you can catch the ferry or fly over. And there are lots of hiking opportunities around the island. I visited the island, I think, 9 times in my year in Timor, and so I managed to get to most places. There are not a lot of roads on Atauro, so walking is the best way to explore this beautiful island. Hiking on Atauro Island is similar to hiking elsewhere in Timor. It's hot, it's humid, it's steep, and you can easily get lost if you're not necessarily following the correct route. So if you check out the notes for this episode on the podcast, there are a series of links. The key one is on the hiking section of the exploringtimor.com website, and there is a Google map on there where I've included the routes for all the hikes I did on Atauro Island. If you click on the routes, it'll give you more information, photographs, and a link to an All Trails GPS route, so you can use that to help navigate when you're exploring. A lot of these I found through trial and error, through getting lost, so I had that experience, so you don't necessarily need to, so you can use those routes to help you find your way around this beautiful place. Let's start with probably the best known hike on the island, which is also the hardest hike on the island. And I wouldn't say necessarily it was my favourite, but I was glad that I did it. And this is to the summit of Manucoco. So Manucoco is the highest point on the island. It's 995 metres above sea level, and it involves quite a steep and tough climb to the summit, and then a probably even more challenging descent because it is quite slippery and easy to lose your grip. Now, I'd highly recommend that you use a local guide to do this hike. That can be organised through your accommodation. There are a few reasons for this. One is it is a sacred area, and this is one of the requirements of the communities, that a guide accompanies you on this hike. Second reason is safety. Even though I have marked out the GPS and there are some signs that USAID installed a few years ago, it is very easy to get lost on this hike. There are sections of shoulder height grass to go through, so if you don't know where you're going, it's very easy to get lost, and there are quite large drop-offs and exposures. I've heard multiple stories of people who have gone up by themselves and had a very scary experience because there are some quite steep drop-offs and areas of exposure and risk, and it is easy to get lost. Relatively recently, a guy went up there by himself. He didn't tell anybody, and he slipped and fell and was in a pretty difficult situation. He wasn't clear how he was going to get out of it. He took inspiration from some local goats. There are a lot of goats on island, and goats are very good at going along very steep rock faces. He's managed to follow the goats to an area where he could pull himself onto the path and then get down, but it was a pretty near miss, and I've heard other people who have got lost and spent hours and hours up there. So strongly recommend a guide from a safety perspective, and also it's not that expensive and you're giving money back into the local community. Atauro Island is one of the poorer places in Timor-Leste, which is a very poor country. 3 good reasons to get a guide for doing this hike. But having said that, it is a very interesting hike, so particularly when you're getting towards the summit, it's an important bird area, and you'll certainly hear the bird life. It's very lush rainforest towards the summit, and the views from the summit, as you imagine, are pretty impressive. So it is a good day hike if you are up for the challenge and you go prepared with a guide and take lots and lots of water. Like, you're looking at 900 meters of ascent and then 900 meters of descent, so that's quite a decent effort in the heat. So that's Manucoco. I say not my favourite, but it is quite an interesting hike to do. One which I'd probably recommend more to most people is the hike from Vila to Makili, which I did talk about briefly in my 10 best hikes in Timor-Leste podcast a little while ago. This is a lot more straightforward. You can use a local guide, which is helpful, and they can explain a little bit about what you're seeing and doing around the villages, but you could probably also do it by yourself. Vila is the main town on Atauro. You can get there by a tuk from Beloi, which is where most people stay. It takes about 20 minutes. I wouldn't recommend walking the road between Beloi and Vila because I've done that a couple of times and it's very boring and flat and there's not a lot of interest and it's just a bit of a slog. It's much better to get a tuk-tuk down to Vila And from there, it's a loop, so you can either start along the coast or finish along the coast. The coastal section is tidal, so you need to go there at low tide, so bear that in mind when you're thinking which way around to do it. One section is along the coast, a little bit of scrambling required, nice scenery. There's a nice beach towards the Vila end, and then you come back on the other part of the loop is to go inland, and you go up and over. You go past the Lady Mary Cave and another big statue of the Virgin Mary, and there are great views of the coast. And you'll go down to Makili, which is a beautiful coastal village which mainly survives on fishing, and there is a statue of St. Peter, which is the patron saint of fishermen, and there's also a women's collective there, which is a great place to pick up arts and handicrafts. So the village of Makili loop, it's about 10k, you're probably looking at half a day. That's a really good walk to do on Atauro Island. Possibly the most popular walk to do in Atauro, though, is from Beloi across to the west coast. Primarily, people will go to Adara. Mario's place has got accommodation there, but I'd also recommend going to Atauro, which is about another hour's walk, which is even more beautiful than Adara. They're both beautiful places, but Adara has a rocky beach and Atauro has a beautiful sandy beach. And there's Choki's place there, which is a great place to stay. This is navigationally probably one of the easiest hikes on the island. From Beloi, if you go past Barry's place at the northern end of the beach and you take the road off to the left, that's the main road. It may not look like a main road. It's pretty rough. I wouldn't want to drive a vehicle over it because you'd probably break the vehicle. But from a hiking perspective, it's okay. And you basically just keep going up and up along that road and you hit the saddle area and then you come down onto the other side. Now you should pop out by the village of Arlo, which is quite a pleasant place to go through and explore. And then that's not far from the coast. You drop down onto the beach, then turn left and you can walk along to Adara and continue along to Atauro. If it is high tide, there is a high tide route between Adara and Atauro, but you want to follow the GPS maps that I provided because I've tried it in the past and got lost, or I got a bit snookered trying to go along the coast at high tide. So yeah, you do need to try and find the inland track if that's the case. Now, this is it's relatively straightforward. A lot of people do it. They maybe take their gear with them over to stay at Adara or Atauro, and then they can organise a boat back from there, back round to Beloi rather than walking back. I will say it's not the most interesting walk on the island. Most of the way you're walking on a road. It does offer some very nice views, but very little shade. So you want to be starting early. As with any hiking in Timor-Leste, I'd always recommend carrying an umbrella, and actually particularly on Atauro Island, because a number of the hikes have very limited shade, and when you're out in the sun for hours it's pretty exhausting, so a bit of shade from an umbrella is really beneficial. That's a relatively straightforward and popular hike to do. You're looking at probably 3 to 4 hours depending if you're going to Adara or Atauro. Now, another really nice walk, which is straightforward, it's on a road, but it's flat, so it's a bit easier to do than going over to the west coast, as if you walk from Bikeli up to Akrema and back. So Bikeli is north of Beloi. That's pretty much road walking all the way. It's not that exciting. There are infrequent, I would say buses, but they're not. They're basically trucks, and people sit on the back of the truck. It's the local kind of transport on the island. But you can get a truck from Beloi, which will take you up to Bikeli, and then start walking from Bikeli. And then from Bikeli going up to Akrema, you're just heading along the coastline. It is a road, but it's more of a track in many places. There's no traffic and it's very quiet, and there's a number of very attractive beaches along the way. You're in the sun the whole time, depending on what time of day you do it, so you need to be careful around sun protection. But when you get to Akrema, that is one of the, there's many nice villages on Atauro Island, but Akrema is one of the nicest. It's the only place really with a white sand beach, and it has a camping spot for those who are interested in spending a bit more time up there. So that's a beautiful place to visit or spend the night and then just come back the way you came. If you look on my hiking map, there are a few hikes I did around from Beloi, heading to Vila and up into the hills. Those are pretty off the beaten track. Those are really for experienced hikers. The middle of the island has got basically a spine, so those hikes go up to basically the spine of the island. You get a fantastic views from there and then head back down again to the coast, but the tracks are not that obvious to follow, as I found out a few times. Now, the final hike on the island is to walk around the entire island. Now, this is the first hike I actually did here. It was the first big hike I did in Timor-Leste, and it took 5 days. You can probably do it in 3 days if you pushed yourself. The 5 days allow me a bit more time to spend in the villages and with the local communities. And also I did the hike in the middle of the wet season, which I would not recommend because it was torrential rain every afternoon. So it was useful for me to do the shorter days so that I could get to accommodation before lunchtime, and then I could sit out the rain in the afternoons. And on this hike, I stayed in homestays. So pretty much all the villages around Atauro, there will be homestays available. The only real accommodation is in Beloi, and there is one place in Vila that you can also stay. So apart from that, you need to be in homestays. These can be pretty basic. I've visited some interesting countries. I've been to Papua New Guinea, I've been to Ethiopia, and the homestays on Atauro Island were amongst the most basic that I've stayed anywhere. So again, one really for adventure travellers who are quite happy with hole-in-the-ground toilets and a bucket shower and limited food options. You're basically eating what the locals eat, so that's probably some rice and vegetables. But it was an amazing experience. You're visiting parts of Timor-Leste where very few other people will visit, but it is a relatively straightforward thing to do. Now, I'd recommend organising it through the Atauro tourism website so they can then connect you with a local guide. Now, you probably I did meet somebody who'd managed to do it by themselves, but you do need to be quite confident around asking for directions and looking at route maps. It's not the most straightforward in sections, particularly around the northern end of the island. I did it with a local guide, and that was a great experience. And it really helped when I was staying in homestays because I had somebody who can help translate because there's not a lot of English on the island. And again, you're giving money back to the local community. So I'd strongly recommend, if you're interested in that kind of adventure, that you organise it through the Atauro tourism website, and they can hook you up with somebody appropriate. So that's giving you a bit of a flavour for the hiking you can do on Atauro Island. If you check out the snorkeling and diving episode, that talks about the underwater activities you can do on the island. And I've also got a standalone episode that talks about more land-based things that you can do which don't involve hiking for hours around the island. Thank you so much for listening to Exploring Timor-Leste. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at exploringtimorleste@gmail.com. Until next time, obrigado ho adeus.